Welcome to the Natural Podcast of Selborne, hosted by Gilbert White's House and Gardens. I am Kimberly James, the Collections Manager here at Gilbert White's House. I love Gilbert White, but I wish I knew a little bit more about the natural world he describes. So every fortnight we will take a deep dive into Gilbert White's pioneering 1789 book, The Natural History of Selborne, to learn more about the natural world both in the 18th century and today. We will talk to some amazing guests and all become a little bit more Gilbert.
In the centre of the village and near the church is a square piece of ground surrounded by houses, and vulgarly now called the Plestor. In the midst of this spot stood, in old times, a vast oak with a short, squat body and huge horizontal arms extending almost to the extremity of the area. This venerable tree, surrounded with stone steps and seats above them, was the delight of old and young and a place of much resort in summer evenings, where the former sat in grave debate while the latter frolicked and danced before them.
Hello and welcome back to the Natural Podcast of Selborne. We are diving today into letter 2, which I think is an odd letter. White discusses trees today, but mainly trees which by the time White was writing were no longer standing. They'd either come down due to storm damage or the need for timber to build posh bridges. So I think the intention of his letter is to inform the reader about the trees that you can find around Selborne, but in particular why he's so interested in trees that have been felled is because obviously by seeing their stumps, he can tell you a little bit more about their measurements and their age. In the letter, he discusses one elm or witch hazel, and the rest are all oak trees, which I don't know whether you can see behind me, but we probably not actually at this angle, but we have an oak tree in the garden which Gilbert White planted himself when he was 10 years old, which is still standing. So we're very fond of oaks here at Gilbert White's house, and it seems like White was very fond of an oak tree too. So reading this letter, my favourite part has to be the last paragraph, which is a wonderful mix of naturalist curiosity, nostalgia, and poetry. White describes an oak tree that used to reside in Blackmore, which is a village very, very nearby to us in Selborne, which was known in Gilbert White's life as the Raven Tree, which is perhaps the best name for a tree I've ever heard. Due to the fact that it was a favourite nesting spot for ravens. It was felled, I presume, in the 1750s when White was in his 30s. And the timber was used to make the most spectacular bridge over the Thames near Hampton Court. But what Gilbert White focuses on is the sad tale of the ravens that lived in the Raven Tree. How the tree was felled in February when ravens are nesting, and how the mother, despite the giant blows that were happening below her, stuck to her nest until finally the tree came down and she was flung to her death, which is very sad and dramatic. And you can hear White's sadness in the letter as well as his respect for the mother raven, and he uses the phrase paternal affection of the raven. But what I want to know is today, and what I hope our guest today will be able to tell us, is a little bit more about how trees are managed today, particularly here in Selborne. I'm hoping he will tell me that flinging ravens out of trees or something is being left in the 18th century, and I'm really looking forward to talking to him.
In the centre of this grove stood an oak, which, though shapely and tall on the whole, bulged out into a large excrescence about the middle of the stem. On this, a pair of ravens had fixed their residence for such a series of years that the oak was distinguished by the title of the Raven Tree.
We are joined by Chris Webb, who is a lifelong resident of Selborne and has been working and looking after the woodlands of the area for almost 50 years. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. Okay. So the letter that we're looking at today is all about the trees of Selborne, and the book obviously is all about the nature of Selborne. What do you think makes Selborne so special?
Obviously, because Gilbert White lived here and wrote the Natural History of Selborne, it's made Selborne a place of interest for many people over many years. So it's attracted a lot of interest, and luckily the landscape and woodland around the village is still in effect the same shape as it was during Gilbert White's time.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, to think that we're looking at basically at this, the same-ish landscape that Gilbert White was looking at. And I think also because Gilbert White has brought interest to the area, he's particularly brought interest of people who are interested in nature and appreciate nature, which I think makes the landscape here all the more special, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I've been working on the landscape in the woods for, as you said, nearly 50 years, and over that period met a lot of people who've come to the village to see what it was that Gilbert White was writing about. Obviously things have changed in the period since Gilbert White's time, but fundamentally, we've got the shape of the village and the land around the village is more or less the same as it was in Gilbert White's time, but he would have seen quite a lot of change if he came back today.
Yes, I think that's important to remember, that although we've been saying about the similarities, he would be, I think, surprised to see some of the differences as well. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about your background in living in Selborne and also working in Selborne?
Yeah, family have been in the village for many generations. We can go back to the 16th century, some branches of the family.
Some of your family would have known the White family.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And,
that's so cool.
It did get mentioned in one or two of the editions of the Natural History of Selborne, where my ancestors were talking to Gilbert White, and they knew him. One ancestor used to get paid a shilling for picking up the stones in the high street.
Really?
So there's been, they would have known that.
Amazing.
Would have known Gilbert White.
How exciting! It's like you're like a celebrity.
No, I'm not.
You are in Gilbert White's house terms.
Yeah, absolutely. But I was interested in woodland and trees from an early age. My great-grandfather lived at the top of the zigzag and helped the commoners who had rights to collect wood. He would go up and he'd go into the woodland and saw up wood for them and stack it up so that they could collect the wood later on. My grandfather worked in woodland. He was doing a lot of coppice work back in the early part of the 20th century. And Dad worked for the Forestry Commission in the 1950s. So with the stories from the family and obviously Dad's background as well, I was always interested to work with trees and woodland and on the land, really. Yeah.
And that's what you've done, both with you've worked with the National Trust for a time, didn't you? But with other organisations as well.
Yeah, I worked for the National Trust for nearly 40 years, 36 years. I did actually work for the National Trust when I was at school. I used to go and clear the paths on the hangar when I was still at school. Then I went and worked for the Forestry Commission at the research station at Alice Holt for 5 years. I worked for myself doing contracting work for a couple of years, and then started working for the National Trust. And now I'm sort of working, since I've left the Trust, helping people with conservation projects around the village and beyond, really, sort of things like hedge laying and meadow management and all that kind of thing, as well as woodland management.
I think you told me last time you met that you have a very grand title in the parish. Was it Tree Warden of the Parish or something like that?
Yeah, that goes back quite a long way. So it's a thing of to do with protecting the important trees around the village. I get asked reasonably regularly to give a little bit of advice as to what can and can't be done with certain trees, and obviously looking out to protect the ones that are important in the older trees particularly. So the trees that you might call veteran trees or ancient trees, making sure that they're in good health and being looked after.
That's amazing, and I mean that ties in exactly to what Gilbert White is talking about in the letter. He's talking about trees which quite a few of them have been levelled for quite some time, but there's the memory of them, or it's the that they are significant old trees. So I mean, it's what you do is so relevant. So in your role as a National Trust ranger, or in any of your other roles, what sort of thing would a day look like? What sort of jobs would you be doing?
Well, I think as far as the woodland was concerned, because that we're principally talking about Selborne Common, the work that I was involved with for many years was trying to restore some of the habitats that had been lost, because particularly through the 20th century, management had changed. So the wood pasture on top of Selborne Hill hadn't been grazed really since the 1950s. So that habitat where you've got a more open type of woodland with old pollarded trees, they're trees that used to be cut on a regular basis above head height, so that the animals grazing in the wood pasture wouldn't graze off the new shoots. A lot of those old veteran trees, and some of them are quite old, they're probably 400 years old, some of the beech trees, which is good for a beech tree. They were being craded in by what you call secondary woodland because of the lack of grazing. So a big piece of my work over that period I worked for the Trust was to try and restore the wood pasture. So that meant clearing areas, creating glades and opening up rides, and getting livestock back onto the common. So that was achieved in the early 2000s, and since then the cattle that go up there have been doing their job of keeping some of the glades open, and they're really important for that. So hopefully going into the future, that management will continue and help to sort of put back the wood pasture, which has probably been there since Saxon times. That management continued right through until the early part of the 20th century. And I think if Gilbert White did come back, particularly say 20 years ago, he would have looked at the common and sort of said, well, where are the cattle, where are the sheep? And where are the people that used to work in woodland and up on the common, collecting wood and bracken and that kind of thing. So he would have seen those kind of, there's been that kind of change going on, it's particularly in the last 100 years. So.
And are there benefits benefits to having grazing up in the landscape? Are they sort of eating things that you want less of, or is it more just a management?
Well, it is. Yeah, it's really the cattle are helping to keep those glades open.
Yeah.
And those open glades will have interesting plants, flowers that are good for invertebrates, obviously, and with the development of the scrub and the secondary woodland that really put an end to those open glades. A lot of the glades that were full of cowslips, for example, they disappeared. So the hope is that with the management that kind of flora will come back, and be part of the common again in the future. So that's the kind of thing we're after. Yeah,
it'd be really interesting. So Gilbert White records the flora that he sees around the village in 1 year in his Flora Selborniensis. And it would be really interesting to go up there one day and sort of do a comparison. Yeah. And that's really exciting. I love the idea of sort of inching it closer back to what Gilbert knew. So I'm guessing in your career as warden, tree warden, and the National Trust, that you've had your fair share of storm damage. So Gilbert White in the letter talks about several trees that have come down in great storms, and we've had some big storms in sort of recent memory, but also going back a few decades. Have you got any particular examples of
Well, the one that really comes to mind is the storm in 1987, 16th of October.
Yeah.
So that did a lot of damage, changed the landscape in quite a few places. So I actually looked at my diary just before I came out to this, and the storm struck at 2:00 in the morning, and then from then on, every day is cutting trees, clearing trees that had fallen obviously across paths and roads, and it was. It was a lot of work that came about as a result. At the end of the day, there was actually quite a lot of benefit in our particular case, because the glades that were created by the storms allowed natural regeneration to take place, and also with the introduction of grazing a bit later on, of course, those glades could be maintained by the grazing. So there was some benefits, and perhaps I think in the early days we sort of panicked a bit too much about the trees coming down. Obviously, where they were on roads or had done some damage to buildings or whatever it might be, they needed to be cleared up.
Well, I think it's natural to sort of, trees that, especially, nice healthy trees that, are coming down, you naturally think that that's a bad thing, but it's really nice to hear that, it has its benefits. What's more, and it means you didn't have to chop them down yourself.
No, absolutely. Well, there were a few that needed to be cut down because they were left in a dangerous state after the storm. Yeah. But luckily the hangar, which overlooks the village, that wasn't too badly damaged. The zigzag was pretty chock-a-block with fallen trees, so that took a lot of clearing up. That southern end of the hangar was the area that bore the brunt of the storm.
Yeah.
The next hangar down from us at Norhill, that got very heavily damaged. Lots of wind blow on that hangar, so Selborne Common was slightly less affected, although if you went down to the southwest corner of the common, there was a big area of wind blow there, which a lot of it got left. Even today, you can still go and find some of the trunks of the trees that blew over in 1987. Then, of course, we had another storm in 1990.
Yes, and this had quite a famous casualty, didn't it?
It did, yeah, the yew tree, so, which would have obviously been, was well known to Gilbert White.
Yeah.
That blew over, obviously, in the churchyard. The storm in 1990 the wind came from a northwesterly direction, and luckily it blew the yew tree over so it didn't hit the church. There was some damage to the church, but not as much as there could have been if it was the 1987 storm.
And to put it into context for anybody who isn't familiar with the Selborne yew, I mean, it's a tree that was thousands of years old, and it was wide, it was a really significant yew tree, and it was very famous because of its age and because of its significance in being, known to Gilbert White. It was a proper, ancient tree that features in many of Selborne's, stories historically, and that storm completely.
We did. Obviously, it was in the churchyard, so it wasn't part of my job really, but we got involved with helping to try and reinstate the tree with students from Merriswood College.
Okay.
They came along in force, and what the plan was that the tree would be pollarded. It was laying on the ground, but take the branches off and then stand the trunk back up. And hopefully the trunk would shoot new branches. That was done. There was an archaeological investigation where the tree had blown over and the roots had exposed some graves under the roots.
Of course.
So that showed probably that the tree wasn't as old as people thought it was.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that it was probably about 1,000 years old.
Okay, well, still in the thousands.
Yeah, just about. There were actually some medieval burials under the tree.
Really? Well,
so
that's so interesting. Gilbert White would have loved to know about that. He was so interested in anything medieval and Selborne related. That would have definitely made the book if that had happened.
Yeah. So we stood it back up. Heavy equipment was brought in to stand the trunk back up. Unfortunately, with hindsight, it's easy to sort of see what went wrong. Really, is that before the tree blew over, the actual trunk of the tree, which is big, was in the shade of its own crown. So when the tree was stood back up, obviously the crown had been removed because there's no way of standing it up without the branches being taken off. And there were some particularly hot summers just after 1990 that meant that the tree got quite hot and baked. So perhaps with hindsight, what we should have done is screened it from the sun, and it may have survived. But what was done, they took cuttings from it, and there is a cutting that's growing as a tree now in the churchyard. So that's it's still there. Genetically, it's still there.
And you can still visit the stump of it. I mean, that's pretty impressive in itself. If you're ever in Selborne and visit the churchyard, which I highly recommend you do, partly because that's where Gilbert White is buried, and the church obviously is of massive significance to Gilbert White's life. But the remnants of the Selborne yew is in itself pretty impressive. That's so interesting. And we have lots of bits from the Selborne yew in our collection. There's a copy of the Natural History of Selborne, which was bound in wood from the Selborne yew that's in our collection. We have little chunks of it here and there. So, I mean, from a heritage point of view, we're still talking about the yew, and it's definitely probably one of the most famous trees in Selborne. That's so interesting. Yeah. I think it was declared definitely not alive in, I think, 92.
Yeah, it was, as I say, it was unfortunate that it may not have worked, but if we had screened the tree a bit more from the sun, it may have survived. But the roots were pretty badly torn where it came out the ground, so it was iffy. In terms of whether it was going to survive or not, but
I've seen the pictures. It was quite dramatic.
Yeah.
Must have been very, scary to find that the next day. I know just from the storms that we've had in my time here, I mean, you can hear the snapping of the trees in the hangar, which is behind us here, from the house. It's
Of course, now we've got ash dieback, which is an issue, and you can see quite a lot of dead ash now in the woodland. A lot of that ash was natural regen after the storms, because ash is one of those species that comes into places which have been cleared or where there's been a storm. They're sort of first generation pioneer trees. So ash has been suffering with ash dieback. But actually, where you look into the areas that have suffered with ash dieback, there's a lot of natural regeneration on the woodland floor.
Yeah.
So we've got beech and ash. Possibly the ash might survive and become resistant to the disease. And you've got other things like maple and hawthorn and blackthorn that are in effect these clearings where the ash used to be. So I think it's I think it's be interesting to see what happens in a lot of areas. If you can leave the woodland untouched, in effect, it'd be interesting to see what comes through, what grows naturally as succession to that the ash dying back. So I think if it's left, I think there'd be changes to the hangar, because the hangar is known as a beech woodland. Of course, climate change is an issue, and maybe some of the beech may not be so be able to put up with the change in the climate. But we can, if we can sort of leave some of the woodland untouched, there will be other things that will take its place. And we might have to accept in the future that it's not going to be a sort of completely beech-dominated woodland that have other things, which I think will be good for the ecology.
Yeah.
Because there'll be more of a range of things that will benefit other birds and insects and invertebrates and that kind of thing. So having a more mixed woodland might be quite a good thing. And I think if you look back at Gilbert White's time, the hangar was being managed by the Lords of the Manor, who were Magdalen College. They were interested in what they could get in terms of income. So in White's time, there was quite considerable felling on the hangar. He records that in his journals, etc. And he was quite upset about the beech going. So he had someone go onto the hangar with beech mast or beech seed and spread that around after the felling had occurred in the open areas.
Was it not his brother that sort of went around? Was it Thomas that was going around with a load of seed in his pocket, sort of?
So Thomas did, and he had his gardener, I think.
Thomas Hall?
No, Hammond.
Oh, is that Goody?
Goody Hammond,
yes.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. She fantastic. We love Goody. She was fantastic. Weeding woman is how Gilbert White refers to the weeding woman, but also the seeding woman.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So quite a lot of the beech now on the hangar, the older beech, are from that era.
Really?
So
wow, that's really amazing to think that the trees that we are, looking out at from Gilbert White's house were planted, sort of almost by him.
In effect, they just spread the seed around, and the seed was allowed to germinate under its own steam. I think the probably beech would have become the sort of dominant woodland on the hangar naturally, but Gilbert White gave it a helping hand. So, or not him, but his brother Thomas, etc. Yeah.
I just love this idea of them sort of with their hands in their pockets
Yeah,
on their walks,
yeah,
just sort of throwing seeds out, as they went on their walk.
But some of those trees, because we had to cut obviously trees after the storm and trees that fall across the paths. And if you did the ring counts, they were coming out around about 1790s, 1800s. So that's about the time, right at the end of Gilbert White's life.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that quite a lot of those trees you can put down to him.
Yeah.
But as I say, I think now, because of all the changes that have happened with climate and disease, etc., we're going to see more of a mixed woodland rather than a woodland dominated by its beech.
Well, I think that brings me nicely on to one of my other questions about the history of the woodlands here in Selborne and the research that's been going on to try and restore it back to how it, was in the past for the benefit of the future. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the woodland, there is actually, if you look at the hangers, which obviously this area is very famous for, if you go back into the Middle Ages, actually a lot of those slopes, those steep slopes were open sheep walk. So quite a lot of the woodland on the hangers is actually quite recent in terms of, say, 200, 300, 400 years old. But there are old areas of old woodland, and a lot of the beech probably was coppiced, so that was coppiced for firewood, principally, and things like hop poles and all that kind of thing.
Which Gilbert White had many.
Yes, absolutely. And then as we go into that period around Gilbert White's time, there was more of an interest in bigger timber. So a lot of the coppicing stopped, and instead of coppicing and producing lots of shoots from one stump, they would have allowed one stem to grow on to become a bigger tree. So in effect, the coppice was singled to produce single trees. And you can see that on the hanger, where these big beech trees today, you can see that they were coppice in the past.
Oh, wow.
So, and on the common itself, there was, as well as the wood pasture, which I mentioned where the grazing happened, in Gilbert White's time, there were sheep grazing there, cattle, and there are records of that going back into the Middle Ages. The earliest records are around about the 13th century. So in White's time, it was in effect a continuation of a medieval wood pasture. But part of the hanger was set aside as coppice, or the common was. And just before Gilbert White's time, there was an enclosure put up that was put there to stop the animals that were grazing on the common from having an impact on the coppice woodland. So there's a big bank and ditch that runs through the common, and that was constructed in something like 1750s, in the 1750s, and that then created the three sections of the hill that Gilbert White describes: the hanger, the sheep down, which is where the wood pasture was, which where the cattle and the sheep grazed, and the high wood. So the high wood was the coppice woodland.
So the last part of the letter is about the raven tree and how it was felled in February when the ravens were nesting. I suppose my question then is how does sort of the wildlife that use the trees have to come into play of how you maintain the forest, and do you see many ravens around?
Well, yeah, there's we see ravens now, whereas go back 20 30 years ago, we wouldn't have seen them very often. So
really?
they're quite common now, so they have come back.
That's good.
Quite good numbers, yeah. With the management of woodland, the big thing locally is the rookeries. And in a way that echoes with what Gilbert White was saying, because they do nest quite early in the year. So if we had to do any work on trees that were close to a rookery, for instance across on the other side of Church Meadow, we had to make sure we'd done that work by middle of January, so that we didn't affect the rooks nesting. So that was important. And then more generally is obviously not trying to do work. Sometimes you had to do work if there was a safety issue, but trying not to do work during the summer months when birds were nesting. Bats are another consideration.
Yeah.
So needed to make sure that we weren't disturbing a bat roost. So trying to keep the work to the winter was important, and on most of the sites which were protected as sites of special scientific interest, you had to follow those rules anyway. As I say, keeping the work to the winter, and traditionally most of this work would have been done in the winter anyway. So it followed the normal pattern, and as I say, there was lots of other work to do in the summer anyway. So focusing on woodland work during the winter was not a problem, really. So, yeah.
Oh, that's good. No flinging Romans out of trees going on here, then that's good. And so the last thing we like to ask all of our guests is, how can ourselves and our listeners be more Gilbert?
Right, yeah. One of the things that comes to mind, which is quite well versed these days, is that leaving, if you've got reasonable garden, leaving some of the garden perhaps a little bit untidy, and making sure there's a bit of a home for bees and beetles and insects and birds and that kind of thing. So perhaps not being too tidy is one thing that I would suggest. Having regard for, as we've just explained, having regard for wildlife, particularly when it's nesting, and trying to make sure it's not disturbed. That's a big thing. If you've got areas of grassland, for example, is perhaps helping insects and pollinators, etc., by either leaving it so that flowers are in bloom, and obviously they can they're useful then for insects, or trying to keep the grassland as natural as possible, and making hay is a good way of doing a traditional sort of management. But so that's my thoughts on that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I mean, making hay is something that we have done here at the museum, thanks, with your help, and something that we're very keen to, do as part of our cycle of caring for our own meadow here. So we're actually recording this in December, and the sheep have just come to start working on the meadow, and then the grass gets long and full of flowers, and then we cut it, and then come late summer it starts the haymaking, and it's a really enjoyable way to see the seasons pass, is the how the meadow is maintained and cared for, and it always reminds me of the pictures that Gilbert White's first illustrator, Grimm, did of then haymaking in the meadow, and we're doing exactly the same thing, in some part using very similar tools and techniques. And
now, we did do a lot of seeding because the meadow had become fairly poor in terms of its range of species back in the 80s and 90s. So we did quite a lot of seeding work, and it's really good to see how much variety there is in that meadow now. And some of the hay bales that I've taken away, I've used to help other people to get sort of flower-rich hay meadows or grassland growing on their own patch. So it's having benefits across the village, in effect. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. Oh, that's such a nice, legacy to the work that the team here and people like yourself who have been supporting our team have been doing for a long time now. And it's definitely, the benefits are showing. I know our last guest, Chris Piper, he is very involved with the garden team, but one of his highlights of his time here at Gilbert White was seeing particular orchids and things crop up in the meadow, which is all thanks to the to the work that's being done here. So that's amazing.
Absolutely.
So really, I feel like the conversation here could be almost just summed up with just let nature take its course. Whether that's the storm ripping through or just let nature. It will.
Absolutely.
It will. It will do.
It needs a helping hand.
Yes. Yes. No, definitely.
Definitely in this day and age, it does need a helping hand.
Yes.
So,
But that it will try and heal itself. I think that's a nice place to end. Thank you so much, Chris.
Okay,
It's been
no problem. Yeah.
so interesting to chat to you, and thank you very much for being on our podcast.
So the ravens built on, nest upon nest, in perfect security, till the fatal day arrived in which the wood was to be levelled. It was in the month of February, when those birds usually sit. The woods echoed to the heavy blows of the beetle or mallet. The tree nodded to its fall, but still the dam sat on. At last, when it gave way, the bird was flung from her nest, and, though her parental affection deserved a better fate, was whipped down by the twigs, which brought her dead to the ground.
Hello, we have snuck downstairs to talk about our object of the episode, and the thing that came to mind is this, which is a section of the Selborne U, which we discussed with Chris. This part, though, interestingly, didn't come from when the tree came down in the 1990s. This actually has been in our collection for much longer than that. So this has been taken off in the 20th century, but it came into the museum around the 1970s. So it is a older branch of the Selborne U compared to some of the other things that we have. But this was a very, very famous, well-known tree that sadly no longer stands, and we're very proud to have bits of it in our collection. And to think that this tree had been on that site for 1,000 years is really special. So what we will do is we will put this on display along with some of the other items mentioned in the episodes, and if you are visiting us, you can come and see them. Thank you so much to Chris for being our guest today. It is odd, isn't it, that we're 3 episodes in and we've already had 2 guests called Chris. That's just what I think. Please like, comment and subscribe to whatever platform you are listening/watching this from. It really helps. And if you'd like to know more about the Natural Trust in Selborne, please look at their website. So they manage a lot of the land around our site, but we are an independent charitable trust. But the hangar that was behind us, which now it's dark, you can't see, is managed by them. And why not come along, and you can walk up the zigzag, see Selborne Common, all the things that Chris was talking about today. And whilst you're there, come down and visit us as well. We've got a lot of really good things coming up in February. We have our Snowdrop Weekend coming up soon, which is half price admission. And we have our garden team giving talks throughout the weekend. And it's a very nice event where we sort of herald the beginning of spring. So if you're looking for a wintry/spring day out, I would very recommend. All the details are on our website, gilbertwhiteshouse.org.uk, and you can also come along and see our current exhibition, which is South Downs Portraits, Lives in a Landscape, which is fantastic and feeds very well into some of the discussions we've been having recently. Thank you so much to Sophia for being behind the scenes. She's sitting behind the camera as we speak. For editing this episode and assisting with all things podcast related and more. Our next episode is going to be about fossils, which is something I find fascinating. Gilbert White loves fossils. It's something that he mentions quite often, but my understanding is that he missed out, dying in 1793, on the scientific community really understanding what fossils were and the sort of the existence of prehistoric life. So I'm really interested to find out what Gilbert White thought these fossils, what fossils were and what the understanding was in the 18th century about all things fossil related. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I hope you join in. Thank you very much.